that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, what's up?
Oh, Oz, we've had a very busy week. I mean, I'm doing well, but we've had a busy week. We're working hard for all the lamestream heads out there. I can assure everyone listening. But in between everything that we've been up to, I did find myself looking at a story this week, Oz, about a journalist leaving journalism for a very big and important job on the world stage. And it made me think about the funny places that journalists end up when they leave the industry. Not all of them end up independent like us. And the story that got me thinking about this was the Sydney Morning Herald's rugby league reporter, Michael Shamus, being poached, apparently, to be the general manager of the new Papua New Guinea rugby league team, the Chiefs, Oz. This is a Cinderella story to me. This is such a great rags to riches to go from a hack, grinding away, hitting deadlines, breaking yarns, all of that nonsense, to being plucked out of the sewer and put in charge of the PNG Chiefs. I mean, this is every journalist's dream, isn't it?
Yeah, it's funny that you think that this is a good news story, Scott. I mean, I like Michael Shamus. His desk wasn't that far away from mine when we worked together at the Sydney Morning Herald. I think he's a very good reporter, and look, good on him for taking a pretty great job on the other side. But is it really something that we should be celebrating when one of the few very good reporters left on a particular beat takes a job in the industry that they've been covering and holding to account?
Yeah, that's not a bad point. I think I'm just happy to see like a journalist winning. You know, in rugby league, I was like, to your point, there's this phrase, I don't know if you're familiar with, shimmy whoosh, which is used to describe taking like a big step to evade a tackle. And
why are you talking to me like I've never watched a game of rugby league before?
Well, fair enough. I just didn't know if you've been in Melbourne a long time. You might have forgotten all of this nomenclature.
Sure.
But I think this is such a significant move from Shamus. We should dub it the Shammy Whoosh, meaning, and I feel like that should mean when a journalist breaks so many good yarns about something that the organization has no choice but to hire them to take you off the board so you can't report about it anymore. I feel like that's a huge move from Shamus, and this is a huge deal. I was like, it's going to be a big job. First of all, PNG loves rugby league. They're going to love Shamus. And it is also quite an important job. There's all this stuff, I don't know if you've followed, about how part of this new team is that it's a soft power move by Australia in the Pacific to counter China.
Yeah, amazing.
I mean, he's literally gone from the pages of the Nine Rags to Australia's point man fighting off Red China in the Pacific through the power of rugby league. This is huge. Once upon a time, America had General MacArthur keeping the Reds out of the Pacific. Now Australia has Shamus. This is big. But Oz, what it really got me thinking about, and I want to ask you, is jobs you'd leave journalism for. Like, what would be the dream offer that would come in for you and you'd go, okay, I'm going to leave?
Yeah, look, despite what I said, though perhaps it isn't really hypocritical because I'm not a rugby league journalist, I would imitate the Shammy Whoosh. I would happily leave my job in journalism to become the GM of the Rabbitohs. I feel like that would be a lot of fun. It'd be a lot of fun to say, sorry, Anthony Albanese, you're no longer allowed at our games. How about you? What's your dream job to get out of this decrepit, failing industry that we've committed ourselves to?
We're very optimistic about the future of lamestream for anyone worried about the tone of this conversation. Look, I think it would be difficult for me to implement the Shammy Whoosh because, like, I'd love to be the showrunner and revive the hit 90s TV show Jag, but I don't think I could write as many articles as I like exposing the production of Jag. I don't think that's going to lead to a revival where I'm the showrunner. I think, maybe the closest, I'd love to be chair of the ABC. If anyone gets in touch with me about that, if Albo ever wants to pick up the phone and replace Kim Williams, I'd probably leave lamestream to be the new chair of the ABC.
Maybe when I'm general manager of the Rabbitohs, I can say to Albanese, hey, I'll only let you back into Rabbitohs games if you make Scott Mitchell the chair of the ABC. What do you think about that?
Oh, bless you for that. That would be huge. I'd be eternally grateful.
Peter V'landys, eat your heart out. Scott, before we get into today's show, I want to talk about a story that we've been working on for the past few months that we finally published this week relating to the Epstein files. Now, most Australian media outlets have reported on the fact this week that former PM Kevin Rudd is mentioned in Epstein's emails, text messages, and diary entries a number of times. Rudd has denied ever meeting Epstein or visiting any of his properties. What has never been reported until now is that in 2013, Kevin Rudd attended a dinner party in New York City at which Jeffrey Epstein was also present, along with around 20 other high-powered figures from the world of diplomacy. And shortly after that dinner, Rudd joined a 6-person board set up to advise the president of Mongolia. Jeffrey Epstein was also a member of that 6-person board, and it also included a number of other high-profile international figures, including the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Rudd has no recollection of Epstein being at that function, and he says he wasn't aware that Epstein was on the advisory board. He only became aware of that after he participated. Should also say that none of this suggests any kind of personal relationship with Rudd, and as I said earlier, he denies meeting him, but it does provide some further details, Scott, what we found out as to why Rudd was mentioned in the files. I think some context that was missing from media reporting until now.
And it's something we're really proud to publish. As you say, we've been working on this since late last year, and we explain and lay out some events really clearly that have never been explained before. So we're proud of it. And yeah, people can read about it on the website.
You can read that article on our website, lamestream.com.au, where you can also subscribe to support our work and get access to all of our other articles. All right, coming up today on the show, the Israeli President Isaac Herzog will be visiting Sydney next week. And ahead of that trip, the New South Wales Police have helpfully declared that it'll be illegal to protest in Sydney's CBD and eastern suburbs. Now, Scott, some people call this crazy for arguing that laws rushed through Parliament under the guise of social cohesion are all really about criminalizing protest against Israel, and then the government literally goes and announces exactly that. We're going to take a closer look at the reaction to that announcement and the heating up tensions in Sydney ahead of the Israeli PM's visit. And what is the deal with how the youth-focused news outlet The Daily Oz moderates comments on social media posts about Gaza? Following some pretty confusing inconsistencies, Lamestream, in the version of Scott Mitchell, sent them a few questions, and they have now admitted that their public explanation so far hasn't been up to scratch and is going to change. We will unpack all of that in today's show. Later, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the world of political opinion polling in Australia. It's something that's come up a few times on the show recently, both in terms of the rise of One Nation and issue-specific polls, and something we've gotten a few questions about from listeners. So we'll look at how polls work, how accurate they really are, and when they can be manipulated to serve particular interests. Plus, in keeping tabs, we take a look at Channel 9's billion-dollar pivot into becoming an advertising company, and Scott goes into bat for Tyra Banks. Scott, on Monday's show, we discussed the growing backlash to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's decision to invite Israel's president to Australia, and we touched on the protests that were being organised in opposition to that visit. Well,
Yes.
Isaac Herzog, the president, is due to arrive in Sydney on February the 8th for a 4-day trip, and protests had been planned in Sydney for February the 9th, the second day of his trip. The New South Wales Police Commissioner announced on Tuesday, however, that protests during the period of that trip would be banned under laws that the New South Wales Parliament rushed through following the Bondi terrorist attack. And the Police Commissioner specifically cited Herzog's visit as a factor in making that decision. These laws allow the New South Wales Police Commissioner to ban protests in 14-day increments for up to 90 days after a terror attack. And when they were passed, there was concern that they would be used to do exactly this, to ban legitimate political protest, especially when it's directed at Israel, under the guise that this would somehow help community cohesion. Now, I'm not really aware of another Western country that has made protesting Israel illegal in this way, this directly, Scott, but is it really a surprise that this is where we've ended up?
Yeah, to be honest, this didn't surprise me at all. And that's because at every single press conference Chris Minns has done for the last 2 weeks, I've heard reporters ask him whether he would extend the ban on protests. What about concerns from some of the Australian Jewish community about safety? would he extend the ban on protests? Now, he hasn't done this. As you mentioned, it's been done by this new mechanism by the police commissioner, covering large parts of the city with a protest ban. But there was significant media pressure on this decision. And I mention that because it's just very bizarre to me that media can bring this up in every single press conference. And then when the decision is made, the media kind of put up their hands and cover this story straight. Like, oh, well, the police commissioners made their determination, as if the press conferences and the pressure being applied by certain journalists from places like Sky News, from News Corp, was not a huge part of the story.
And we should say that even though the police commissioner makes this decision, Minns has said that he met with him multiple times in the lead up to this decision.
Yes.
And they discussed Herzog together. So, I mean, the police commissioner, they obviously talk about these things.
Exactly.
It's not an arm's length process.
Exactly. And look, when you bring up, compared to other countries and how they've cracked down on pro-Palestine protests, like this probably is harsher than we've seen in comparable countries to Australia, Oz. But what I would say the precedent it does fit into is Australia, and specifically New South Wales, has very tough laws on protests and very draconian laws that keep getting worse and worse. You go back to when George W. Bush came to Australia in the mid-2000s, half the Sydney CBD was basically a militarised zone for days, with snipers on rooftops and the public banned from entering certain areas at all. So this follows in that tradition. So while some of the most draconian crackdowns on pro-Palestine protests we've seen in the last few years, it does, I think, fit into that tradition.
So the Palestine Action Group, which is the group organizing the protest, they said they will still march anyway and are appealing to the police to give them some leeway. Interestingly, two Labor MPs, and these were laws pushed through by the Labor government, Chris Minns is a Labor Premier, Sarah Kane and Stephen Lawrence, they have said that they will march. So it'll be interesting to see, if they get caught up in any potential police repercussions. The police commissioner's actual specific argument for this ban I found pretty incoherent, Scott, and honestly very worrying in terms of how low the bar is being set for when they can use these powers and criminalize protest. He said that factors considered by police in making this announcement included at least 10 anti-Semitic incidents that were being investigated by police, which is a comment that seems to suggest that a rally like this will inevitably lead to anti-Semitic incidents, which is something that I think there's very dubious evidence for. However, he also said, we're still history. I've considered that there remains a significant risk to community safety by public assemblies. So is he saying there that these protests themselves could be the target of an attack, and so he needs to stop it happening to kind of stop anyone being injured? It's a very confusing statement to say simultaneously this protest is going to cause anti-Semitism to be unleashed, but also I need to protect them from being the targets of someone else acting. It doesn't really make much sense to give those two reasons as to why protest has to be shut down right now.
Yeah, I think my overall take on this is, when it comes to the relationship to Bondi, the worst mass shooting in decades, it did target the Jewish community. So I think it's fair to say if there's going to be a public gathering of a large number of Jewish Australians who do happen to support Herzog, you want them to feel safe in a public space. They deserve to feel space. I think there's a fair argument for increased security. But banning protest from virtually the entire city centre of Australia's biggest city during the visit of a guy cited in a genocide case that is moving forward at the International Court of Justice, it's hard to see how you couldn't have found a better compromise for safety than banning the expression of that. That kind of speech is vitally important, and allowing that, I'd argue, is super important for social cohesion, Oz. It is that allowing that speech is part of social cohesion. How much social cohesion do you have if you're saying to that whole section of the community, the state doesn't recognize the importance of that as an issue? We're not going to protect your right to express that. That sends a message that if you care about this, then our vision of society doesn't include you. That clearly doesn't help social cohesion, which makes me sort of question whether any of this is about social cohesion and whether it's really about protecting Herzog and the political agenda of his visit.
Yeah, I will say if you use the term social cohesion one more time in this podcast, I'm quitting.
Well, it was about debunking that phrase.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah,
argue.
yeah. It's obviously not your fault. It is a really interesting interview with the Race Discrimination Commissioner this week, where he said, in a lot of ways, that term social cohesion has become a euphemism for assimilation, and that in terms of how the government and the police are using it, right? They're sort of saying there's a defined set of principles, and if you step outside of those, you are threatening social cohesion. As you put it, that now includes criticizing the Israeli president who's been cited in a genocide case. If you criticize him, you're undermining social cohesion. That is seemingly as far from that idea of like bringing the community together as you could imagine.
Mm. So then, turning to the Daily Oz. It's a lot of people's favorite, cute, colorful, approachable Instagram youth-focused news outlet, Oz.
Right, Daily Oz, you're talking about my Instagram stories? You're talking about something else?
Yeah, exactly. That's the real Daily Oz. Real heads know. And it's had like a massive rise to success. It has 641,000 followers on Instagram, and they claim to reach over 2 million Australians per month across all their platforms. Its staff get regularly featured on places like the ABC as guests, speaking about news for young people. And that success, Oz, has been built largely off explainer posts on Instagram and they're very similar in a way to the explainer articles published by traditional media. There's subjects like what the new hate speech laws mean and things that would not be out of place on the ABC or on the Nine newspapers. But the Daily Oz has kind of cannily brought this bright, approachable, friendly brand and design to Instagram to break these things down. Now, some people who have followed the Daily Oz closely might know that simmering in the background has been this minor online controversy about them disabling comments on all of their posts about Gaza. The comments section on other stories on the Daily Oz page have been bombarded by some pro-Palestine users on Instagram questioning this, accusing the outlet of bias in its approach to disabling comments about that topic. And the Daily Oz has explained their policy by starting to put a statement on the bottom of all their posts where comments are disabled that says that under Australian defamation law, news outlets can be held responsible for what is said in the comments section, and without the staffing to be able to moderate all those comments they get, the Daily Oz has chosen to disable them. Have you followed this sort of controversy and the explanation of it?
Yeah, a little bit, though a lot of what you're saying is kind of interesting and new to me. I mean, I've been pretty vocal about my criticisms of the Daily Oz for a while, particularly their very odd coverage on Israel and Gaza, which I think seems even more out of step in some ways with their audience's expectations than the way the bigger media outlets are covering this stuff. And I noticed that they never allowed comments on those stories. Some of their fans would occasionally get in touch and say, oh, you're kind of like upset about this. It's actually because they don't want racism. They don't want hate. They're trying to do the right thing to protect their community. The fact that, is this changed now?
No, I didn't change any of this. This is all yours.
Shit. Okay. Damn. Maybe I am saying something earlier. Doesn't matter. But honestly, that argument never really made a whole lot of sense to me. And, you can call me cynical, Scott, but I had this feeling that it was always much more about people. I had a feeling it was always much more about them wanting to avoid people writing, hey, how come you're so willing to project explicitly progressive values on literally every other news story except for this one?
It's an interesting question. And yeah, what made me finally decide to get into this and look into it is that on Monday this week, the Daily Oz posted 2 posts about the Epstein files and left the comments on those stories. And in the comments, a few people were making some pretty wild claims about individuals the Daily Oz had named. And it was interesting to me. I'm not making the case here, Oz, that they should close down the comments on those stories. It's kind of up to every outlet what risk they're willing to take on these things legally. But my interest was this. If closing the comments on those Gaza posts was about defamation, you can't defame a state or a country or a government, Oz. So under the Gaza posts, if someone said something negative about Israel or the IDF, there's no defamation action that Israel can take. But here with these Epstein posts from Monday, There are specific people named by the Daily Oz. The comments section was going ham with speculation. So if it's all about risk, why would they shut down comments on the Gaza posts and not this one? It seemed weird to me. So I put questions to the Daily Oz about this, and I asked, do you stand by your public explanation for closing comments on Gaza posts as being purely a legal decision? Or is it in fact an editorial decision by the team at the Daily Oz? And in their response, the Daily Oz admitted that their public-facing explanation up to this point doesn't accurately capture our full moderation policy, and they're changing that explanation after we sent them questions. They said that really, Oz, they look at three things when deciding whether to turn comments off. First, they turn off comments on posts deemed high legal risk. Second, they turn them off sometimes because of resourcing at different times in the week or day. They can't moderate the posts. And they also said certain topics rapidly attract hate speech and targeted harassment. And they said it is important to the Daily Oz that all communities are able to read the news in as safe an environment as possible. Now, that last one was really interesting to me, Oz, because I can understand Israel-Gaza. You know, that's a story that can inflame. People are very passionate about it. And maybe the Daily Oz goes, okay, there's no defamation risk, but it is a topic that fires people up. It could attract some anti-Semitic remarks. That's their decision to make. But I wanted to see if that was a consistent policy. So I went back and I found their posts about Pauline Hanson wearing a burqa in Parliament last year. On those posts, comments are turned on. One of them has 6,500 comments on it, many in support of Pauline Hanson. Several comments I found attacked Lydia Thorpe, Fatima Payman, Maureen Faruqi, using pretty racist slogans like they can, quote, go back to where they came from. One comment calls Lydia Thorpe, quote, a cheap, desperate slag. And there's some vile comments about Islam and Muslims that I will not repeat on the show. So why are those comments left open? I think if you looked at things through a straight risk assessment on racist speech kind of lens, Hanson's burqa stunt is much higher risk of attracting hate speech than a post about, say, the current death toll in Gaza. If that's your concern, why is one open to discussion and one's not?
Yeah, great question. Great question.
And is it really about, as the Daily Oz says, a safe environment for all communities to read the news? Like, well, the Daily Oz did not directly respond in their answers to whether Gaza stories were treated differently than other stories. So I guess that leaves that question open, Oz.
To me, Scott, what I think is really interesting about what you've uncovered there is that this is a media outlet whose audience is overwhelmingly on Instagram, right? Instagram is not a separate part of what they do. It is kind of the core of what they do and how they kind of sell their audience to advertisers and do a lot of brand partnerships and reach a lot of people. So the fact that they've got such a confusing approach to this pretty fundamental question is kind of surprising. You'd imagine that figuring this out would be what they put most of their time and energy into. But I guess, like, yeah, to me, it does kind of confirm what the ban on comments on Gaza stories is really about. It is about trying to stop their posts being flooded with people saying, we don't understand why you guys use certain language and defer to the IDF and use terms like Hamas-run health ministry, you know, as we covered earlier in this show. And I mean, here's the thing. They're allowed to do whatever they want. It's their post. It's their page. It's their posts. They're allowed to have whatever comment moderation policy works for them. But I think when you project yourself as an outlet that is doing news differently or better, it's more in touch with younger people, and that's your approach, it doesn't feel great. And people are allowed to, like, point it out, I think.
Yeah, I think when you project that, you are welcoming being held to a certain standard of the values of that generation and those kind of things. And so I think it does invite questions, at least, about it.
I'm glad you asked those questions. I'm glad you got those answers. All right, coming up on the show after the break, a closer look at the world of opinion polling and how it drives so much of our political conversation.
Oz, we're obviously in the middle of a pretty worrying time in Australian politics, and it's something we've talked a lot about on the show lately, the rise of One Nation, this Labor government that doesn't seem very fussed about that, and really a Greens party on the left that isn't cutting through at the moment. And so many of the events over the last few weeks that we've covered, whether it's laws being passed, the coalition splitting, these events have in part been driven by political polling. Every party is frantically trying to understand if they're losing their base to one nation, what direction do they go? Are they taking a hit after how they handled the Bondi attack? So like this week, I thought we could take a bit of a step back and I could have a conversation with you about polling, how our listeners can understand what it means, when polling matters, when it doesn't, and how polls drive the way that journalists cover politics.
Yeah.
So, like, to kick that off, even in the last week, we've seen some pretty worrying new polling. According to the latest Roy Morgan and Redbridge polling Oz, 1 in 4 Australians would vote for One Nation today, 25 and 26% respectively in those polls. Those are shockingly high and the highest the party's ever.
It's all going well in Australia, guys. Don't stress.
Yeah. Every time you think it can't go up higher, it seems to. On top of that, the Redbridge polling, which went a bit deeper, showed Australians now trust One Nation more on the economy and housing affordability than they trust the Liberal Party. And a recent Demos poll found that Pauline Hanson was virtually tied with Albanese as Australia's best communicator. As someone who knows more about polls than I do, Oz, and you once had a go at being a pollster yourself, I wanted to ask you about some of these numbers. What has been the most shocking? What tells you the most about what's happening? Just how do we begin to unpick a lot of what matters and what doesn't here?
Yeah, it feels like a good time to have this conversation because polling, as you say, is driving a lot of the political action at the moment in terms of what's literally going on with parties, also how it's being covered. And we've gotten heaps of questions about how it works, particularly after we covered the polls looking at support for Invasion Day a couple of weeks ago. I think also, sorry. We've talked a lot on this show about how the Liberal and National parties are being impacted by One Nation's rise. Why that is so interesting in the conversation about polling is because the rise isn't tangible yet. One Nation isn't yet taking seats off the Liberal and National parties. It's just something that the polls are picking up on, right? As one really practical example of how polling can set an agenda, even though nothing physically has happened yet on the political side of things. There's another side to polling that is really interesting in terms of how it shapes and is currently shaping our politics. That is issue polling, right? There's two kinds of polling generally. There's the political polls where you look at how people are going to vote, what party they're going to vote for, and then the issue polls, which ask questions like, do you think immigration is too high? What do you think should happen with tax rates? The 9 papers in particular do these polls a lot, and they can really change the way journalists talk about issues, and they can also be used to put political pressure on parties to introduce new laws or to kind of act in certain ways. So we are living in a moment where polls are having, I think, an outsized impact on how our politics is conducted.
Yeah, on that impact, something that's always been funny to me about reporting on polling is the media often report those numbers like they are incredibly scientific. The mood of the nation has been boiled down to this number in black and white. It's definitive, etc. But I think, Oz, the longer you're in media and journalism, you realize that those numbers and how they're interpreted are filtered through the pollster's view on politics, the journalist's view on politics, how everybody interprets these things. So before we get into specific questions about what's going on, I want to talk about that impact thing. How does polling work in Australia? And then how does it get filtered to us?
Yeah, it's a really good question because obviously we read about polls through the media, but it isn't media companies themselves that conduct polls. It's actually market research and polling companies. And there's a bunch of different ones that operate in Australia, and some of them have got exclusive relationships with outlets and provide them their results. Others just kind of do them anyway and hope that they get picked up. And most of the work these polling companies do is not for the media. It's for other clients, right? They do market research for different companies. They work with unions and lobby groups. That's how they make their cash. But they often use a political polling as a way to drum up some headlines and get their name out there. It's kind of a marketing exercise for them. Some polling companies people might know about. Essential does their polling exclusively for The Guardian. The 9 papers, they work with a company called Resolve. There's Newspoll, which has gone through several different iterations. It's currently conducted by a company called Pixis. So that's the kind of groups that do the public polling. Now, political parties, Scott, also all do their own polling as well. And sometimes they use the same firms as the media companies are using, and sometimes they use their own market research companies. Largely that's private, though sometimes when a political party wants to, put a certain issue on the table or frame the narrative around an election, they'll leak their internal party polling to the media to kind of, get the response thereafter. So there's a few different ways polling is operating in this country right now.
Yeah, so just break down for us how the actual polling is done and sort of how accurate the numbers that we get are.
So the basic principle is pretty similar. The idea of a poll is you speak to a bunch of different people, you ask them who they would vote for if an election was being held, and you add up the results, right? It's pretty simple. But you can see that there are probably already some challenges with that. Like I could ask you, your mum, your dad, everyone you know, how they think about a particular issue or how they would vote in an election. That wouldn't necessarily give me a great snapshot of how the country feels, right? So to be able to do that, you need to be able to reach people in different ways. You need to be able to talk to them on the phone. You need to be able to message them via text. You need to be able to reach them online to make sure the people that you are polling are coming from as diverse a background as possible. And it's not just the methods of communication that is critical here, it's the kinds of people you're reaching as well. Most of these polls, to get really accurate in Australia, need a sample of around 1,000 people. And what they do is they try and shrink the Australian population down into what it would look like if it was 1,000 people. So you roughly need, 50-50 gender split. You need to make sure there's enough younger people, enough older people, enough people from the cities, enough people from the countries. If you polled 500 people, but most of them are 25-year-old white women from Brunswick, your poll is going to say Larissa Waters is going to be the Prime Minister, when you know that is actually not going to be the case. So it's an important thing that polling companies do is try and find the right number of people to make sure, and the right mix of people to make sure the polls are accurate. Every polling company has a different way of doing this. So that's why you get polls that have different results. And sometimes some polls are a bit more favorable to one side of politics than the other. It's not an attempt to be biased, I believe. I think it's just to do with the structural ways in which they conduct their research. And do you want me to just go into accuracy?
Maybe I just can quickly interject. So, I've heard a lot of people, just friends, regular people kind of go like, oh, well, I've never been contacted for one of these polls, or, these polling agencies never poll people like me. They're not accurate. How good are they at doing all of that weighting and accounting for that you talk about? Are polls in Australia good, or are they actually pretty bad?
I mean, they're generally pretty accurate. Every individual poll, there's a chance that they can be wrong, and polling companies sometimes do miss. But polls in Australia do a pretty good job of predicting election results, right? Particularly the ones that are released in the lead up to an election. At the last election, for example, 2025, most polls, they did underestimate Labor's vote by a couple of percentage points, but every poll that was released in the month leading up to the election had Labor in an election winning position. We just don't really have a problem here where there's a wild overstatement of a particular party or I can't remember the last time we had an election where the poll said one party was going to win and the other party did. That doesn't mean, Scott, that every single poll is as accurate as every other poll and that we should take everything at face value, right? All of these polls basically just tell one part of the story. One of the things that's emerged in kind of political science and polling recently, Nate Silver from the US, people probably know his website, 538. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's only nerds like us who know it. He aggregates political polls, and this is something that is being done in Australia as well. The idea is one poll might not be totally accurate, but if you combine the last 10, 15 polls, then theoretically you've got a bigger sample size, you're smoothing out any errors, and that gives you a better sense of what's going on. And when I discuss polling results on this show, I tend to reference those aggregates, in particular political science William Bowe. He provides a really great one on his website called The Poll Bludger. The thing, though, about polls, Scott, and this is where it gets interesting in terms of how they're interpreted, how they're written about, and how they influence politics. Even the most accurate poll only tells you one part of the story, right? They can tell you how part of the electorate feels at a particular point in time. It doesn't tell you why they feel that way. It doesn't tell you how that translates to specific seats across the country. It doesn't tell you how firm or locked in that support is. It doesn't tell you whether it's going to carry all the way through to the next election. All of this stuff is up for debate, conjecture, and analysis. And I think it's why, even though the polls are kind of pointing in a similar direction right now in terms of One Nation, there are so many different conclusions being drawn about what it means for Australia.
So now I want to turn to some of like the big narratives that are going on, Oz, and get your opinion on which of these stack up or not. I mean, one is how Labor is doing. In Patricia Karvelis's column for the ABC this week, she said the government continues to struggle in the polls. And meanwhile, there are other analysts and some Labor supporters on social media going, the polls at the moment are great for Labor. Like, their primary vote is way higher than any other party. They've got at least a 6-point advantage over anyone else in the two-party preferred, whether that's the coalition or One Nation, whichever way you cut it. And basically, I want to know, and I actually don't know who to agree with there. Like, how do you interpret what the polls are saying at the moment? Are they good for Labor, or is Labor struggling?
That's a great example of what you're just talking about, right? In terms of like, the numbers are there. No one's disputing them. What do they mean? How good or bad are they for every side? And obviously people's own personal political biases can come into how they interpret these numbers. The really boring answer is that, like, it's complicated and everyone is kind of right, which I think is important to just acknowledge, that there is no total, like, divine interpretation of these things, right? Like, Patricia Karvelis says Labor is struggling. What does she mean by that? Labor's primary vote remains at historically low levels, and it is about 3% lower than it was at the next election. So, yeah, I guess there is a world in which you could say the numbers show that Labor is struggling with its support across the community. But at the same time, like, what's the point of an election? It's to decide who forms government. And Labor remains the clear favourite to form the next government if an election was to be held. Now, even though their vote is down, their opponent's vote, the Liberal National Party's vote, is down to such an extent that it doesn't really matter that they're struggling historically. They're still going to win. So by that interpretation, it's hard to see how they're struggling, but you can make the case either side if you really want to.
Yeah, that makes sense. The biggest thing I wanted to ask you about, though, which has become, I think, such a big conversation in Australia, is around single issue polling, which you mentioned before. We had a number of polls last week give very high approval to a lot of the policies that followed the Bondi massacre. The Guardian Essential poll last week had 73% of people saying they supported banning public displays of terrorist symbols, 63% supporting stronger gun laws, and 62% said they were behind police powers to curb protests, and the majority also supported new laws on hate speech. But then, Oz, weirdly, despite Albanese being the Prime Minister who passed almost every single one of those measures, most Australians disapproved of Albanese's handling of Bondi, but he did those things they approve of. So, like, how the hell do we square that and what that means about community support for those measures?
Yeah, there's a few different, I think, issues with trying to understand that, right? Because when you ask people about an issue in the abstract, they're generally thinking about that issue in the abstract. Like, what do I think about guns? What do I think about hate speech? As soon as you mention a politician's name there, they're not even necessarily thinking about how a politician handled an incident. Some of them might be, but a lot of them are just going, oh, Albanese, I hate that guy. Right? Like, you could ask rusted on Liberal voters, what do you think about Albanese doing, literally, like, list all the policies they want, and they would still disagree with them because of their personal, I guess, issues with the guy and the fact that they want someone else to be Prime Minister. That's kind of like the first thing about how those two things can seem incongruous, but both exist at the same time. Issue-based polling, Scott, it's something the media really loves because it's like the cheapest to do. It's much less complicated than actual political opinion polling. You're just asking one question and you're getting a yes or no answer largely. And then it's very easy to write stories off the back of that. You know, 80% of Australians want gun reform. Most Australians think Muslims are terrible, right? That's just like how so many media stories are written off the back of issue-based polling. And that is exactly, I think, the problem with it. Not the fact that the polling exists. Like, it is useful to understand what Australians think about all of these issues. The reality, though, is most Australians are totally incoherent. Like, if you polled most people, they would say they wanted schools and hospitals to be better funded. But if you ask the same people, do you want to pay higher taxes? They would say no. That is interesting to know, even if it's deeply frustrating for people on the left-wing side of politics. And it's very interesting and helpful for political scientists and academics to unpack. But when media organizations cherry pick particular issue-based polls to run news stories that often align with their broader editorial agenda, you get a political discourse that is kind of, I think, poisoned by not very helpful data. And the 9 papers, I think, in particular, are increasingly like the worst perpetrators of this. They phrase questions in a really complicated way. Often they are trying to, it seems, push people in a certain direction. Generally speaking, Essential, who did those polls for The Guardian, I think they're better, but the questions that you raised, I think, have their own issues. And as an example of that, right, this question of hate speech, like, do you think there should be laws to protect people from hate speech? People look at that question and they're not thinking about the way that a specific law is being framed. They're saying hate speech is terrible. Of course there should be laws. What do you mean there aren't laws to protect people from hate speech?
Yeah, I've thought about that so often when I've seen issue polling of, like, if you put the words hate speech or terrorism into a poll, people are going to vote against that because they're going to go, I don't want to respond, I'm pro-hate speech or I'm pro-terrorism symbols. So they just vote in favor of banning those things. They're not necessarily thinking about, well, how is hate speech defined? Maybe a position I agree with could be included in hate speech. I'm not across
just
the detail
protesting
of
the
this
Israeli
thing.
president count as hate speech. You know, that's not really being teased out in these questions. And I mean, it's still useful. I think I don't want to try and pretend that this stuff isn't useful, because it's really interesting, particularly over time, to see how Australian attitudes shift on certain questions. But when the media use them, and they certainly did in this way, when they say most Australians support a ban on hate speech as the government introduces new laws to do X, Y, and Z, it creates this false appearance that the vast majority of Australians do want to, you know, do all the things the government has done since then. They make a big, broad question about a very specific set of laws.
And so we get to One Nation, which has been the biggest story in the polling. And I wanted to ask you about how polling actually influences coverage of One Nation in particular. And I might have to set up this question before I ask you about it, Oz. So, like, we've talked a few times about our frustration with the media not really covering One Nation robustly enough. I wrote for the newsletter for subscribers last week about how the last time One Nation rose, the media did end up treating them robustly and trying to get some lessons out of that. And I think we're right in our discussions we've had on this show about a lot of the reasons for that, right? Like, there has been a rightward drift in the media generally. I think there's also been a watering down in newsrooms, a lack of expertise on how to cover race issues and far-right politics and these things. I do think we're right about that. But I think another one that maybe journalists would bring up to defend their coverage is that when a lot of journalists interview pollsters, a lot of these pollsters are currently telling them, like, well, look, One Nation is getting very high, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. These may not actually translate into real votes on election day for One Nation. We've seen this before where Australians answer polls like this out of frustration with the coalition. It's a protest response. This many people may not actually vote for One Nation. And so I wanted to just focus on this kind of argument here. And I wanted to ask you, because there are a lot of smart people saying this, and it's an interesting point. Is that a genuine reason to not take these polling numbers we're seeing at the moment as definitive support for One Nation and not giving too much weight to them?
Yeah, interesting question. I think the bit that I agree with the most from what those people you're quoting are saying is that, yes, we are still 2 years out from an election, and a lot can happen between now and then. So just because you see a poll today doesn't mean that is what will happen when we fast forward to 2028. But, and I think this is really important, right? In terms of understanding what is going on right now, election day results don't magically appear out of nowhere, right? It's not like people go into a box for 3 years and then reemerge on election day and say, these are now my views on politics that are not informed by anything that's gone on in the preceding term of government. Election day results are the result of what has gone on in the community in the lead up to that election. So if right now, a year in or nearly a year into the Albanese government's second term, if every poll is showing that One Nation has the support of 1 in 4 Australians, that's probably what's going on right now at this moment in time. That could go up, it could go down, but it's not going to magically disappear just because pollsters or analysts or others hope or think that it will. And I think that is why I think it's important to have this conversation, because I think there is this tendency or temptation to wave it away because of what's happened in the past. But in some ways, nothing like this has happened in the past. And that is partly why some of the pollsters are hedging right now. The figure is so big, it's so unprecedented. No minor party has ever reached this level of support in Australian history before. It's throwing a lot of the assumptions and models and structures that every polling firm uses out of whack a bit. I also think they are worried about potentially this being a big focus of the political conversation, and then maybe One Nation does slowly peter out. So come election day, they haven't done that well, and everyone says, well, the pollsters are wrong. They didn't get it right. The thing is, though, election days tell us how people feel on election day. They don't tell us how they might be feeling 2 years before, i.e. right now, if that makes sense.
And yeah, I mean, in trying to understand this One Nation surge, I've been paying a lot of attention to what pollsters are saying. And I want you to fact check me on this take a bit, Oz, on this. I listen to the guy who runs the Essential Poll, Peter Lewis, on the Guardian podcast, one of the guys behind Redbridge, Tony Barry, on the ABC's podcast, and they were both super insightful and interesting interviews. Obviously, both these guys are way smarter than I am about polling, but I wanted to play a little bit of how both of them sort of talk. This is particularly Peter Lewis at Essential and how he described this rise in One Nation. Now, Oz, he's completely right about that, to be clear, but it struck me listening to both of them talk about this, Oz, that pollsters are virtually the only independent experts that federal politics reporters talk to. On other beats like health or whatever, there's lots of experts with lots of different expertise. But in political reporting, pollsters are the only people journalists can really turn to. But the thing about polling, by its very nature, is it's based on the past and past political trends. And that's what you're using to talk about the future. And when I listen to these guys, they are very correct in saying all of this, that, in the past, the One Nation vote has risen and then collapsed. It has been a protest vote for Conservatives, and then that support has gone back to the coalition. And so they are emphasizing that. But it's all tied to what the political landscape was in the past and all of the work that they've done for years, showing voters won't support the coalition if it moves further to the right. So they look at this and their lens tells them that there shouldn't be firm votes further to the right of the political spectrum in Australia. But also, we've seen across the US and Europe, these ultra-nationalist, anti-immigration parties can find support further to the right than a traditional right-wing party can. The Republican Party or the UK Tories tried to go further to the right and actually lost. But then a nationalist movement like MAGA or Reform UK can go further to the right because they can come at it with an anti-establishment, anti-elites message that is different. And I'm not saying that these pollsters aren't very smart, and actually what they say is correct, but I just think the emphasis is on a pretty definitive left-right axis and viewpoint, and they don't tend to look at the kind of broader picture of political philosophies and how they can engage different constituencies, and that ultranationalists are different to traditional conservatives, and give enough weight to the possibility that this support for One Nation could be firm. It could be a giant turning point. And then the journalists, as a result, don't take it as seriously as maybe they should. So fact check me, Oz. What do we think of that take?
Well, I think that take about the hyperfixation on where people sit on the left-right axis is really, really fucking spot on, to be honest. And that's because, sure, there are some One Nation supporters who are like, I'm really, really right-wing, and I don't think the Liberal Party is right-wing enough for me, and that is why I'm voting for One Nation. I'm not convinced that is most One Nation supporters. My evidence for this is looking at what is happening with the kind of far-right movement across the world, and how much of that is more driven by like disaffection at the status quo than any coherent analysis of where people sit on the scale of left to right. Like the Labour Party in the UK is losing votes to reform. That's not because those people have jumped vastly to the right of the Tories. It's because they feel like their financial situation isn't great. Like there's a by-election coming up in the UK. It's always been a Labour seat, Manchester. It looks like it's going to be Reform that wins that seat. I don't think that is because all those Manchester voters have decided they are now more right-wing than the Tory party. I think the same thing is happening in Australia. A lot of voters are annoyed and frustrated with both major parties. And in some instances, these might be really right-wing voters. In some instances, these might be Labour Liberal swing voters who are just sick of voting for one or both of the parties and feeling like over the last 10 years, things haven't gotten better. So I think you are totally right on that. And I think that is a limitation of some of the analysis that is going around right now. I think the other issue, and you kind of spoke to this as well, people saying, oh, you know, like we've seen this before, it's fizzled out, don't freak out. We actually have never seen this before. Like we've never seen this before. One Nation's vote has never been this high. And as you said, we've never seen this global resurgence of the far right at the same time. We've also never seen One Nation be backed by Australia's richest person. We've never seen the party have this level of professionalisation. We've never seen it hire this many political operatives. We've never seen it establish local branches across the country. There's just so many things that it has never done before. And again, I'm not saying that like they're going to form government and nothing could happen between now and then. I'm just trying to sort of say we can't rely too much on what has and hasn't worked in the past because the current situation globally and domestically is really different. And I want to go back to your newsletter, Scott, that you mentioned that you wrote last week. The other thing that has really changed here, and I think is underpinning a lot of assumptions analysts have about One Nation, is that in the previous rises of this party, the media and the other political parties essentially worked very, very hard to condemn One Nation, to expose their policies and try to destroy them, right? In terms of the language the media used, in terms of how they approached Hanson, in terms of how the political parties refused to adopt her rhetoric. Now, on the political side of things, that's obviously not the case anymore. Like, both major parties now are far more to the right on race and immigration than they have been for a very, very long time. In the case of the media, Hanson has more support than ever that she's had from the media. Not just from broadcast platforms like Sky News and Karl Stefanovic's podcast, right, where she can just go and speak to lots of people without pushback. The 9 papers like The Age, who saw themselves at the forefront of the racist rhetoric that Hanson was spewing, now use language that is designed to normalize her, right? They used to call these parties and politicians extremists. Now, The Age and SMH's chief political correspondent, Paul Sakal, says Hanson's rhetoric is, quote, plain and uncompromising. So if you're relying on the same things that worked to debunk and expose Hanson 20 or 30 years ago, I'm sorry, they don't exist anymore. Like, the newspapers that did this work are now seemingly doing everything they can to boost her. And I think that is in some ways more worrying than even what we've seen with Trump and the media in the US, Scott. So I think, look, there's a lot of smart people saying, let's not lose our minds, and I agree, but I also don't think that means we should fall into the trap of just thinking that it'll disappear, because once upon a time it did.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to look back on what happened in the 90s, where the media was hugely responsible for Hanson's first rise in popularity, but then they turned on her, or at least sections of it did, and exposed a hell of a lot about her, pushed her. She looked foolish when examined under scrutiny. She fell to pieces. The party, in many ways, split because journalists did their job and investigated and examined One Nation. And it took them, over 2 decades to recover from that damage. So it's fascinating to go back and look at what good media can do in these situations. And it's both kind of inspirational, but then incredibly depressing when you realize how far we are from that when we're supposed to be making progress as a society, going backwards.
Yeah, and because I gave such a broad spray there, I mean, I want to point out that Sarah Martin at The Guardian in the last week has done interesting reporting looking at, Hanson's undisclosed gifts from Gina Reinhardt, including access to her plane. But then at the same time, I read the chief political correspondent at The Guardian say, hey, there's not much here to see about Pauline Hanson. It's not going to, do what the polls suggest. Just kind of take a deep breath, everyone. You would think for an international outlet like The Guardian, who is covering UK politics that it would be a bit weird for a political correspondent there to say, this is not going to happen. It's not really that bad. Don't worry. Like, I can't reiterate enough how much Nigel Farage is going to be the next Prime Minister of the UK. So that was an odd take from me. All right, coming up after the break, Scott, one of the largest media companies in Australia pivots to billboards. And should Tyra Banks be allowed to sell hot ice cream? Not sure what that even means? Well, stick around. Scott, one of the little media stories that was brewing over the summer was Nine's sale of its radio division. It was an interesting media story for a couple of reasons. Since it bought out the old Fairfax papers, The Age and the SMH, Nine has really been pitching itself as this 360-degree media company, right? It's been telling advertisers and audiences that it can reach people on radio, in print, and on television. So the decision to get out of radio was interesting. And then there was a second question of, well, who's going to buy these stations in Australia's media market? Nine's radio network is not really a big money earner, but it still has a decent share, particularly the breakfast programs on 2GB and 3AW, hosted by Ben Fordham and Tom Elliott. And even if it doesn't make huge amounts of money the way it used to, it has a huge political influence. I mean, Chris Minns' agenda seemingly is set by what Ben Fordham says every morning on 2GB. So Nine ends up selling the radio stations for just $56 million. It's a lot less than the $275 million they were worth when Nine fully acquired them back in 2019. There's a write-down of nearly $250 million in 7 years. And even if you account for changing audience habits, it does feel like management fumbled it. And they kind of should take some heat, I think, over things like the company's failure to take digital and podcasting seriously, and seemingly not having any strategy around growing their audience beyond just, how do we hire another white guy with a booming voice who can reassure baby boomers that their prejudices are actually okay? I mean, is that too mean an analysis of Nine's radio division?
No, not necessarily. I mean, like when we have covered commercial radio in the past, we've had a couple of emails actually, Oz, from people who work in radio, cover radio, not that many, but a few, saying like, hey guys, what do you mean radio is dying? Like, our stats say it's bigger than ever. The companies say that they're killing it. Well, if radio is killing it, Oz, why is this network, which has like certain time slots that are number one in a certain market, why is it worth a fraction of the value that it was a few years ago? And I'd say, like, if you talk to people who really know radio, they are well aware the industry is in really bad shape. They know that every network pads the hell out of their audience claims, and they know the official ratings are garbage and are completely ridiculous.
Yeah, we've done enough boring our audience with numbers chat, but, you know, one day we could do a breakdown on how the radio ratings are like the least scientific and accurate, you know, out of all the rating systems. Yeah.
It's like the equivalent of like a fortune teller, like throwing, you know, muck on the floor and trying to read whether 3AW's up this week.
Throwing muck on the floor. You could have gone with reading the tea leaves, the entrails. What fortune tellers is on muck on the floor?
I don't know. But I think the really interesting thing here, Oz, is that these stations over the years have been able to attract these big name talents, right? Like your Ben Fordhams, your Tom Elliott's, your Ray Hadleys, etc., because of the ownership and the ownership of these networks willing to throw massive salaries at these guys. Even if it didn't always make financial sense at the time, they knew that if they lost these people, they would lose prestige of the network, that the influence and the name was more important than it making perfect balance sheet sense. And I just wonder, with these new owners coming in, Oz, are they going to be willing to put a Ben Fordham or a Tom Elliott on over $1 million a year? Like, that's a lot of money if the company is worth a fraction as an asset as it was in the past. Like, how long are they going to keep that up? Or are we going to see, like, AM radio and shock jocks really like not have that level of talent behind the mic anymore?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, God, imagine a world where the level of talent of Tom Elliott can no longer be attracted to 3AW.
When I say level of talent, I mean like name recognition and celebrity.
I get you.
You know?
I'm not making fun of you. I'm making fun of the, you know,
yes,
more
I know. I just wanted to clarify for people who aren't, you know, necessarily across the way, like producers use the word talent.
Yeah, I mean, like, looking at who's bought the stations provide some answers. They were bought by Sydney's billionaire pub baron Arthur Laundy. His son Craig is a former Liberal MP. He's actually got a weekly segment on 2GB. His other son, Stu, was a contestant on The Bachelorette. I think Sophie Monk's season. I think he won. So they're like, regulars in Sydney's gossipy tabloid news. It does feel like we're not going to see any radical changes. I mean, Laundy is a billionaire pub baron who is associated closely with the Liberal Party. So I don't think we're going to see any kind of political shift change. Whether or not he continues to like sign big checks to those guys, I'm not convinced he will. But I think like in the case of, say, someone like Tom Elliott, where else is he going to go? He's probably going to have to cop a haircut, and that's kind of it. To me, Scott, I kind of think the other really interesting thing, and in some ways more interesting than the sale of the radio division, was the other announcement Nine made that day, the same time as they announced the sale of radio. They announced the acquisition of the outdoor advertising company QMS for $850 million. Now, I think this caught a lot of people by surprise, even though Nine has actually previously expressed its desire to buy QMS's competitor, O Media, another billboard company. Nine had all this cash after selling off Domain, and there were a lot of hopeful people in the TV and print divisions of Nine who thought maybe, oh my God, they've gotten rid of Domain, they've got like $1 billion, like this is going to be so great, they're going to invest, they're going to like upgrade our systems, they're going to bring on new journalists, it's going to be an amazing, aggressive growth strategy for Nine. It seems sadly, unfortunately, for all of those people that is not what Nine's plan is. And I think this is like the inherent challenge with publicly listed media companies. Like so often, the smart long-term decisions that would help you stay relevant to build a sustainable subscriber base, all of that gets ignored for how do we make a big headline by selling this and buying that so we can bump up the share price, keep shareholders happy, and the board and the CEO can stay in their jobs for a little bit longer. And seeing like another giant media company do that when they're one of the few places left with real journalists, kind of sad to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And even like on the sale of a 2GB, obviously most people associate that network with the shock jock style, but it did employ journalists who went to press conferences and
absolutely
broke stories and whatever and did the bulletins. And it's just the trend of Nine over the last however many years now to cut journalism and put that money into commercial enterprises that do not involve journalism. That has been the decision making again and again and again.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. It's an underrated part of the sale is like they're getting rid of an actual journalism media unit and replacing it with an advertising unit. I mean, the kind of what do we call it? What do we call it in Australia? Anti-competitive. The kind of anti-competitive component of that is interesting. It's just like now one less independent advertising company that's been swallowed up by a corporate media company. So none of this, I think, is great for Australia, journalism, advertisers, the public. It's all pretty sad.
Totally. Oz, this is the moment I've been secretly waiting for. I am about to share with you maybe the most controversial take about journalism that I've ever shared on this podcast. And it has to do with Tyra Banks. Are you across Tyra Banks, the former supermodel and TV host who has moved to Australia and opened what she is calling a hot ice cream shop?
I love when you ask me these questions like, are you across this like famous cultural figure doing this very popular thing that has been covered so many times? Firstly, what do you think like I care about? And secondly, what do you think I do all day?
Yeah. And also, like, despite me being way more out on popular culture and you being way more in, I'm like, are you across it, Oz?
Yeah. So to answer your question, I am across it. I find it bewildering. It has not appealed to me whatsoever, but Australians seem to be obsessed with this thing. The lines, go on for hundreds and hundreds of meters to try and get this hot ice cream.
Yeah, and I feel like I didn't look this up, but I feel like it made all of this American press as well, like places like the New York Times and stuff were like, Tyra Banks has moved to Australia and she's selling something called hot ice cream. It's been like a genuine global story. So this week, Oz, the ABC published an expose which has forced Banks's shop to stop calling it ice cream because it doesn't meet the food standards definition of what ice cream is in Australia. Basically, the story showed that, ice cream is frozen. It contains a certain amount of milk, fats, and all of these things, whereas this hot ice cream, as Banks has been describing it, is really like a sort of sweetened, fluffy beverage. And as a result of the ABC's questions, the food regulator stepped in and told Tyra Banks and her company that they cannot market this as hot ice cream. They can't use the phrase ice cream. And so they are now changing it. And this was a ABC exclusive by your old mate, Casey Briggs. Casey's great. The story is accurate and it's pretty funny. Genuinely, this segment has no criticism about him before you jump to his defense.
Okay,
but here is my controversial take. I believe
Here we go.
journalists should not narc on stuff that is fun. I want Tyra Banks to be selling her crazy hot ice cream, a product that makes no sense. I like that it is out there and it is funny. And this to me fits into the category of when sort of younger reporters go to their older bosses and kind of do things like hey, did you know that you can buy Amyl over the counter in sex shops and that young people are getting high off it? I'm like, no, don't tell the old people. Don't tell the editors that happens. Don't pitch that story. Let people have a good time.
That feels like a homophobic story to pitch as well, for the record. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you. Correct. Like, let people eat their hot ice cream and sniff their Amyl in peace and don't narc on things that are fun. So, Oz, what do you think of this take, and have I destroyed my journalistic integrity by sharing it on this show?
I think you have clearly eaten this ice cream while being high on Amyl, and you've had such a great time. You're like worried. You're worried that both of these things might be ripped away from you anytime soon. I mean, I agree with you generally on the principle of like journos should stop being narcs. You know, I think as well as the example you gave, I just think any journalist who like consumes illicit substances should not be like writing up police drops on, you know, how many illicit substances they seize at the border. It's like, you're part of this. You're part of this. You're not better than anyone else. On this particular one though, and it's not my job to defend Casey. Like, I like Casey. I've known him for a long time.
Oh, here he comes. Here he comes.
He's a good journalist.
Old mates
you might be surprised
network.
with what I'm going to say. You might be surprised with what I'm going to say. You know, in his expose on this, he mentioned that he'd been kind of working on this for months. And I was curious as to like why the ABC's chief election analyst was so excised about Tyra Banks' hot ice cream. And look, it was summer. Maybe he'd seen it. He's a very smart guy. He's done a lot of different things in his journalism career. And clearly he was on the money because the regulator did step in and the ice cream has to be renamed. Now, is that narking? I think the difference here between this story and like, let's stick with the Amyl comparison than the other one for a second. Like Tyra Banks, she's a very well-known, very wealthy person. She's got this venture capital-backed business, right? This is like a business that is making a lot of money off people, giving them a lot of money. If there are questions there about whether its marketing and food standards are right, and every other business has to fit into that, doesn't matter what you're selling, doesn't matter what kind of business you are, I think that is a valid story to investigate. That is sort of my take on it. I don't think you've destroyed your journalistic credibility. I think it does sound pretty obvious that you're aping for a Tyra Banks sponsorship opportunity on this show. And if that was to come true, Scott, then I would happily eat or drink this hot ice cream and smile and talk about how delicious it was.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's not a coffee, as she keeps reminding us.
It's a hot ice cream.
I mean,
how many times do you have to say it?
It's not. It is ice cream. It's not ice cream, but it's not coffee. Yeah, look, I mean, full disclosure, I actually pretty much agree with you. And, you know, like disclosure, all of my comments on this entire topic have been for the purposes of satire and do not reflect my real ethics in journalism. I'm trying to entertain, Osman, before I get aggregated. We're always getting aggregated on this show.
Are we? Who's aggregating?
No,
us?
we're not. We're not.
No.
I just heard other podcasts say that aggregators.
They do
should
like
stay
saying that.
away.
I mean, like, that's because they're really famous and have like millions of listeners. But it would be amazing if news.com did it. It's like, podcaster loses it defending Tyra Banks. Like, I would click that.
Absolutely. Please, somebody aggregate us.
Okay, and on that note, that is where we will leave things for this episode of Lamestream. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left us a review. And better yet, you can even share it with a friend. You can also email us questions or tips at contact@lamestream.com.au, and you can subscribe to support the show and read all of our articles at lamestream.com.au. Thank you to our producer Bez and our video producer Schwen. Thank you, Scott. See you next week.
See you next week.